Hi everyone and welcome. We're down here in my wormery, and as you can see I've got a couple things out here on the bench ready to go. It's a VermiBag Tote with the European Nightcrawler. Up here on the bench we've got the European... Up here on the bench is the VermiBag Tote with the... Hi everyone and welcome. We're down here in my wormery, and I've got my VermiBags out here. One of them is the VermiBag Mini with the European Nightcrawlers down here. And up here on the bench I've got the VermiBag Tote with the African Nightcrawlers. And it's been 11 days since these bins were last fed, and they're about due for a feeding. Usually not much to see in here because on this one I've been trying my best to feed only on the top surface, because it is a flow-through type system where the materials just keep settling down and you really just keep piling up. So kind of it goes against the whole thing that I often do, which is to stir up the contents of the bin and do a really thorough inspection. Doing my best to keep to the, sort of operating method of using one of these and only adding food to the top surface. So feeding these usually goes pretty quick. We add the food, we close it back up, we leave it be. And it's in this bag that we usually spend a little bit more time examining what's going on. In this bag, most recently, last time we fed, we had set up a horizontal migration, meaning we had deemed the material in the bin to be pretty far along, pretty close to harvesting. So in an effort to try to lure the worms out of the material, all the material has been pushed to one side and only one side of the bin has been set up with fresh bedding and food. So we're going to get to see today how that's progressing in terms of luring all the worms out of the finished compost. And it'll be my first check-in since we set it up that way, so I'm curious to see how it's progressing. But we'll take care of feeding this one first, get it out of the way, and then we'll proceed to this one here. So let's get the camera a little bit closer down into this one so we can see what's happening. One little complaint I guess I have about the VermiBags is that they seem to become a little bit of a haven for these little tiny flying insects. It's funny because a lot of them are actually just lying here dead and they just drop right off. So the few that remain, I guess, are the remaining ones that are alive. I don't know, I'm not sure, I can really necessarily blame it on the VermiBag per se. I'm just saying it's in my VermiBags is where I see this only. And it might just have something to do with the fact that it's the only of my containers that have lids. So maybe we're creating a nice little sheltered space for them to be in. I'm wondering if maybe leaving it open might result in fewer insects being in there. A little bit counterintuitive thinking, but I'd like to see if I can somehow do away with having so many little insects cruising around in here all the time. All right, let's see if we can get a little bit closer and turn on some light here. So those 2 sheets of cardboard that we just removed don't really do much anymore in terms of moisture retention. I believe the main workhorse in that aspect is this piece of plastic holding down the moisture content of the bin, not allowing it to evaporate away. And it's right beneath that piece of plastic that you often find the greatest number of worms hanging out, enjoying the nice moist conditions. A lot of this material is starting to stick to the bag too. So I'm still kind of getting accustomed to using the plastic bags and all the quirks and features, as some internet personalities like to say. It's a little trivia. I wonder if anyone recognizes that little phrase and if they know who it is that normally uses that little phrase, quirks and features. I bet you a lot of people will know because he's a pretty popular internet YouTube celebrity. And I just gave you a hint because it is a he. So now, as I peel back some of these layers here, this paper is also more of like a hangout as opposed to being a covering, but it's also a place where that collected moisture that comes off the plastic has a chance to drop down onto and create a place for the worms to hang out. So I like having that there. And I guess as we start to work our way down, we're going to start encountering some of the previous feedings and applications of bedding. I'm wondering what this weird white ooze stuff is on the edges. It's a little bit unusual. I don't recall seeing anything like that in the past. I'm assuming that once we pick through this here a little bit, we're going to find some of the food items that were most recently added. The cool thing is that we've got a whole bunch of stuff on top, which I'm not always 100% sure if it's just remainders of the coffee that was probably added as part of the feeding resting on top, or if it's castings. The castings and the coffee definitely bear a resemblance to one another. A little bit difficult to tell them apart, I think, sometimes. So I'll be optimistic and I'll say, hey, these are all castings. They do kind of look like they are castings, and it makes sense that it would be. So I'm just kind of spreading out some of this food stuff that was in a little bit of a pile here on top, just to kind of give ourselves a little bit less of a mound right there in the middle, because I guess I'm trying to make a little bit of space where we can add more, create a little bit more of a mound. I guess I'm just wondering, why is there still so much residual food in here? And I'm resisting the temptation to really poke down deep and get a sense of, how much of this is actually food and how much of it is actually castings at this point. But yeah, I guess I'm going to do my best to try to stick to my own rules here and not succumb to the temptation of, exploring here. So yeah, why don't I stick to the game plan here? I'm gonna go grab a handful of food to throw in here. Guess we'll start with some of these stems from a couple vine tomatoes. And I believe for the most part the rest of the stuff is all just really, really tiny scraps of food in my bag of frozen veggies and fruits that remains in the deep freeze in my fridge for worm feedings. And sometimes it just starts to become like a bag full of shake, a lot of little tiny particles. And I would think that this is the sort of stuff that the worms really like, because it's tiny in size and really is stuff that they can just dive right into and feast on pretty quickly after it's been added to the bin, because of the surface area. It's not just one big chunk of something that they have to work their way through. It's tiny particles that they can really make their way through pretty quickly. Alright, so I've got my supply of grit here. It's a pulverized eggshell. I'm not sure if I added grit the last time we were in here, but I'm going to go ahead and add some now. I guess to top it off, we're going to use some of my staple feeding item, which is the used coffee. Let's scatter some across the top. Ooh, I always worry when I turn this container upside down to pour some out that it's all going to come flowing out. But I really wanted to just limit the amount that I put in here. I didn't want to have too much. That's pretty good. So I think we're going to use a little bit of leaf cover. We haven't really done much in terms of covering up the feedings lately because we've been using just that newspaper. But I think we may have not been as generous as we could have lately with the bedding material. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to give this material a nice coating of dry leaves. I got a feeling they're going to appreciate that. I think the bin might be running a little bit low on carbon source and bedding type materials, so it seemed like a fitting time to give this one a nice thick layer of bedding across the top. So things are looking pretty good in here, but it's usually not very eventful, just because we are trying to stick to my kind of non-interference objective here of not tilling it up and disturbing it all the time. I really want to let it function the way it was designed to, which is as a flow-through system, and that we don't really get into examining the material until some point in the future when it gets ejected out the bottom and we harvest the castings once they're all finished. So I look forward to doing that at some point in the future. I'm not sure when that might be, but for now I'm just trying to stick to my newest game plan on these, which is to feed on the top only and not disturb the material going through. I am definitely contemplating the idea here, though, of, you know, replacing these cardboards the way we found them, but then not zipping up the container. I'm wondering if that might yield better results. Probably different results from some point of view, but better, I don't know. But it's probably worth a try. Because I'd love to do away with having these insects flying around all the time. So why don't I just leave it unzipped like this? I'm going to put this container back in the corner, and we can move on to feeding the VermiBag Tote with the African Nightcrawlers. I'm very curious to see how things are progressing here ever since we had set up the migration. You know, here again, I guess we're seeing flying insects hanging out. Can't really say that there's that many, although I guess when we get to this lower level, that's somewhat more. Alrighty. And I guess I wouldn't mind doing away with these. You know what? My window is open, so you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to run this right over to the window and place it outside, see if maybe they'll leave. So we'll see what happens. Now, I think for a while we were using a single piece of plastic to cover this bin up, and I think it may have been at the last maintenance check when we were in here last that we had set up this second piece of plastic to help the original first piece of plastic. They're both doing the same thing basically, which is trying to keep the moisture from evaporating out of the bin. So any moisture that does try to leave the bin ultimately gets captured by the plastic. And when the temperature drops a bit, that vaporized moisture condenses. The little vapor droplets, little drops of dew, and eventually goes right back down to where it came from. So it's doing its job, it's doing it well, and the worms are obviously drawn to it. They're really enjoying the moisture that it collects. And that's why now I've always got to kind of evict all the little worms off of the plastic every time I go in here to do maintenance, because they're usually on the plastic enjoying the moisture that's built up. Or, here we go, or they're right beneath where the moisture is collecting. So this being right beneath the plastic seems like the obvious place for moisture to drop down into and collect. And that just puts the calling card out for the worms to come in and enjoy it, come up for a little sip. So let's see, before we knock all these little guys off, just so we can get past this layer, just trying to see if there's anything out of the ordinary that might be noteworthy. Nice big fat African Nightcrawlers all just hanging out here. Ugh, alright, so this piece of paper is very close to tearing in half. Very close. Oh, I think more than just in half. It seems like it's just coming apart at the seams. We'll see if we can give this paper one last chance to remain in service, and then at some point soon I think it'll just become bedding. Alright, wow, what a job just trying to get to this level. It's almost like an archaeologist working their way into a new find. Interesting stuff to see here. Before we disturb it, I guess, would be a cocoon right there on the surface. So yeah, it was a week ago. Not a week ago. It was at the last visit that we had decided, hey, let's get this bag staged for harvesting. So the idea was that all of these, you know, quote unquote finished castings or almost finished castings would be our target. And before we can take it out of here, we want to know that all of the worms have left, you know. So that's why we had established this opposite side of the bin, opposite of where the worms should be. A feeding zone. All fresh bedding, all fresh food, all designed to attract the worms. So as long as we got all these worms that collected on the top surface, let's go ahead and introduce them to the feeding zone. Obviously, worms everywhere, still occupying the castings, and it's because it's not pure castings. You know, there's plenty of bedding material here, large chunks of cardboard just like that, and probably food scraps in here as well. Still, it's only been, you know, not even 2 weeks since we fed over here, meaning the last feeding must have been somewhere out here, probably down the middle. So I'm sure there's a fair amount of food scraps remaining down in here. So maybe the best chance of finding material that's close to being evacuated would be over here on this far end. I don't believe this end of it would have received food anytime recently. And it's definitely nice. Look at that. It's virtually worm-free. I mean, we pulled back a good number of handfuls of material there, and I don't recall seeing even one worm. And these are pretty large nightcrawler worms. They're pretty good in size. So I think having one just sort of slip by is unlikely. But look at that. This was really not what I was expecting, you know. I mean, I had hoped that a number of the worms would make their way over into the feeding zone. I knew a lot of them would like to hang out on the top surface because of the moisture that collects under the plastic, but I wasn't really expecting to see, you know, almost a complete exit of the material. But so far, I think that's all we've seen. We've seen pretty clear evidence that this side of the bin might, at this point, be evacuated. Well, at least for the most part. We just found ourselves a worm. Then again, I've been kind of poking around back and forth. Little guy could have just stuck to my glove. Came over for the ride, thanks to me. But, okay, here we go. Another little worm hanging out over here. Quite small, actually, if you think about it. Not a very large worm. When you think about that, these are African Nightcrawlers, a pretty good-sized worm. So maybe the explanation for these little small worms on the far side is that they're fairly recently hatched, right? I mean, if you found one of these big, huge monster worms over there, you know, you would have to think that, hey, what's making them stay? You know, why are they inclined to not go to where all the fresh food supply is getting thrown in? But we're not seeing any large ones because all the large ones have figured out where to be, where to go, the good place to be, and they're already over here, I would assume. And the only worms that we're still finding in this material that's almost finished castings at this point are probably ones that were born here and emerged here within this bin recently. Yeah, a lot of these are very small. I saw a really tiny one just a moment ago. One thing that I'll typically do with my material that's been sort of nominated as finish, I like to air it up. I like to sort of take hard, solid chunks that may have come together and, you know, break it all up, get little air pockets in there. That'll help with the drying out process, I believe, at least I hope. The other thing I think that it does is it provides little avenues for the remaining occupants to be able to move through. So I think by having the material kind of uncompressed, if you will, or dechunked, trying to come up with the right word for it, if there is a good word for it. I believe that those are probably the two key benefits to doing it, and that's why I do it for the most part. Combined with a little bit of stirring, right? So I'll take some of that more dry stuff that I find and try to blend it together with some of the more damp stuff that I find. At the same time, you might be noticing me, you know, finding stuff that I think should probably be over in the feeding zone, so I'm moving it over there right away. Larger chunks of bedding, any sort of food scraps I find. Not that I'm finding many or any, but something I just found seemed like it could have been food, so I threw it over there. It's a banana stem. It's not bad. Definitely like what I'm seeing here. I think we more or less, you know, aerated the better part of the stuff that I've been considering as my finished castings over here. And we've actually kind of stacked it up over here on the opposite side of where the feedings have been occurring, using all of this as an opportunity to pick out stuff that we find and put it in its proper place, if we can figure out what that is. So let's just do a little tiny bit more of this, not much more. Gonna see how much of this is really still more or less finished castings. It does seem like it's almost all that. I just think that at some point we gotta see where that feeding zone that we built last time starts. These worms are definitely doing what one would hope that they would do, is go where you want them. You know, you set up a migration, horizontal migration. I normally don't expect to see results for a little bit, you know, a little bit of time. These African Nightcrawlers have more or less depopulated what I'm considering to be the finished castings in this bin. Almost to the point where I would, you know, say that this stuff is done. Let's, you know, use it. You know, use it myself personally. You know, I mean, if I was selling this or whatever, I'd, you know, be a little bit embarrassed to say that it's finished, because it is full of all kinds of scraps of who knows what. But I really don't think that's a problem. I think that's all good stuff, you know. I think it just provides ongoing nourishment for the beneficial life forms that populate this material. So I don't really see scraps of material in my compost as a bad thing necessarily. Let's move on now. Let's figure out what to do next here. We've done a pretty good job picking through and qualifying this stuff as really almost done at this point, you know. I really wouldn't have expected it, but a thorough search, I think, has pretty much told us that it's almost there, you know. So I'd like to continue this action. It seems to be working well. So to do that, I'm going to bring this whole pile here, but treating this at this point as more or less my feeding zone. But try to bring it over in such a way that it remains intact for the most part, if possible. I'm going to use my other hand here a little bit. Almost just tipping it over, I guess, at this point, right? I was almost able to tip it over and reveal the side of it that was up against the side of the bin. Here we've got some of the food items. Our trusty corn cob, one of our staple food items that we keep encountering. It is now part of the, you know, horizontal migrations feeding zone area, trying to draw more and more of the population out of the finished castings. These are, whatever, big banana peels, right? So instead of throwing them down into the pit quite yet, let's see what we can identify as still food items that are in progress. Something like an orange is really not what you normally find in a worm bin, so it's probably not too surprising to see that it's still in progress. It's a mango pit, one of the ones that I had sawed in half to give the worms easy access to its insides. This is the stem of something, but I can't even tell what it is. So that's cool. Those in progress food items are the ones that they'll most likely be able to start working on soon and consuming. But it's equally important to have that backup continuing supply of food in here as well, so that it too can be breaking down and getting ready for consumption in the near future. Not right away. It'll take some time to get to that stage, but we're going to feed right in here, and then we'll try to level things out a little bit. But yeah, I guess we've probably now seen the majority of our population, and they don't seem that many, really. I gotta admit, you know. I mean, we saw a few stragglers floating around in the material, smaller worms, but I was in a way expecting to see many more for some reason. But you know, gotta remember, I started this population out less than a year ago with 100 cocoons, so you know, I can't just suddenly expect to see a huge population explosion. I can hope for it and wish for it as much as I want, but to think that it's actually going to happen anytime soon is maybe wishful thinking. All right, let's start setting up their feeding zone. I got some scrap paper laying around here. I'm going to use as bedding. Throw that in there. I guess we got this box of leaves. We can throw a little bit of leaves down here on the bottom too as bedding. I guess I'm going to try the 2-handful dosing here. There seems to be enough room for it. That was 1 handful. And that's 2 handfuls. A lot of really small, tiny stuff. Some of it is just particles of ice. And they'll probably enjoy that anyway. A little extra moisture never hurt. Although the top surface of this bin is you know, nice and moist from the plastic, causing that recirculation terrarium effect, I call it sometimes. I just get this feeling like the rest of the material throughout the bin is maybe a little drier than it needs to be. Makes me feel like I'd like to somehow jack up the moisture in here. And usually, you know, a feeding like this will be kicking off moisture in the process of it, you know, thawing out. So right away as it's thawing out, it's going to generate some moisture. And then as the worms eat it too, that'll just further break the material down. And as this stuff just, you know, disintegrates, it'll continue to kick off moisture. So, you know, I'm not sure it's really a desperate case here. You know, if it was really arid, I would get the squirt bottle. But you know, I'm gonna hold off on that. I think we're still safe here. It is a little bit drier than I think it needs to be. But I'm not gonna wet this thing down. I'm gonna let it continue to ride out the way it is, because I think the moisture. Let's get these worms over on this side too. Right, so the moisture that we want is going to be in that food already, right? We want that in our material. So I think the best way to kind of retain it, keep it in the material, is to make sure that we're focusing at least the plastic material over here to help it recirculate and drop out. And over here, it might not be such a problem if we allow it to start to dry out at this point. Let it continue to air out a little bit. Some of these chunks that are tending to stick together might actually crumble apart more readily. That's usually kind of the texture that you want for vermicompost. This is maybe just a little bit too damp yet for you know, sifting. If we were to sift it, it wouldn't go through a sifter very readily this way. And I guess the other benefit to letting it dry out a little bit is that we make it less appealing to the worms. You know, the worms that are still hanging out in this material will eventually start to sense that, hey, maybe it's not quite as cozy here as it could be, and they'll go looking for a more moist, a more damp place. And over here where the feedings are being administered, that's where we're probably going to have the most moisture with all that fresh food added. So yeah, let's figure out how to restore these coverings. This always belongs over the feeding zone. It's my feeding zone indicator. Coffee filter. This piece of paper, I'm wondering if maybe at this point we use it only over the feeding zone. And at this point, maybe even fold it over to make it look less disintegrated. Now it'll almost seem like a whole solid piece of something again. I did have this one piece of newspaper laying around here. It's already got a hole in it and it's dirty and everything, so I just like to have a little something in between the castings themselves and my coverings, like my plastic coverings. So we're going to use that new piece of paper there to cover up the stuff over there. And now I'm going to experiment a little bit with maybe focusing our terrarium effect over only the feeding zone and giving the rest of the material out here a little bit of a chance to dry off. So that over there is good, and this part of the bag actually has a whole bunch of little holes in it. It's hard to see, but it's a potato bag full of little holes, and I think that in itself will allow for a little bit more airflow over on this side, not to mention that we're also leaving the outer edges of it uncovered like so. But even the paper, if it wicks up any of the moisture, we'll also be able to send it right through those holes and let it evaporate out. So I think this is probably going to be a good way to leave it to continue on. And I've got to say, I'm also quite pleased with what I'm seeing here. It's a little bit further along than I had anticipated it to be. So it's always nice to, you know, get results that are a little bit better than what you had anticipated. So, all right, I think we're done here. Got my VermiBags all taken care of. All my Nightcrawlers are fed. So I'm glad to have all that taken care of, and hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, as always, please remember to give me a thumbs up. That's really appreciated. Also consider becoming a subscriber to the channel as well. That's really appreciated too. All right, everyone, have a great day. Thanks for watching. Bye now.